guys know the story by now. The Super Nintendo is about to launch in the US, and with Sega of America under new leadership, they decide to pack in their new flagship mascot title free with every piece of Genesis hardware. Sonic the Hedgehog would be the media darling of 1991, garnering all sorts of praise for its speed, graphics, and sound. It's credited as one of the smartest moves Sega ever made, turning then Sega of America president Tom Kalinske into somewhat of an overnight gaming celebrity. Sonic would sell millions of hardware units for Sega and spawn multiple sequels and spin-offs in the following years. Sonic became the face of Sega instantly, portraying their 90s attitude as the coolest thing in gaming. Sega slapped Sonic onto everything too, advertising it every chance they could. He even had an animated TV series. All of a sudden, the Genesis was no longer the underdog system battling the great Nintendo juggernaut. Instead, it was the cool thing to own, and to hear most people tell it, Sonic was the reason for it all. In this episode, you will get a look at the original Sonic game for the Sega Genesis from my viewpoint. I wasn't a bandwagon Sega fan that jumped on board with the hype. I had owned my Genesis since late 1989, and had loved the platform long before Sonic showed up. The question is Sonic even a good game, and did it deserve all that praise? The launch of Sonic was mind-blowing. The gaming magazines jumped on it as one of the best games of the year, and the ratings came in to prove it. Whether you read Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, GameFan, or whatever, Sonic was the talk of the gaming world. What had been a small group of classmates at my school that actually owned a Genesis the previous year, all of a sudden exploded into many more. Eager to get my hands on it and give it a go, I was expecting nothing less than a Mario killer, a game of such quality that the Sega name would never be spoken of ill again. Firing up Sonic, I was met with nothing short of an incredible game. It was just like the magazines had preached to me for the months leading up to its release. The graphics were unbelievable. They were colorful, loaded with parallax scrolling, and everything was animated impressively. I even dug the music, which was just as catchy as could be for a title like this. The gameplay wasn't just fast, but also had a sense of freedom and boundlessness to it. Sonic could jump damn near across the entire screen in a single go, and if he had enough speed and momentum, he could make it multiple screens before he landed. I hadn't played anything quite like it before. There was no question there was something special here, and I liked that about it. Sega may have been trying to create something to compete with Mario, but Sonic couldn't have looked, sounded, or felt any more differently. I actually appreciated that, and looked forward to playing it even more to see just how crazy the stage design actually got. As I got deeper in, the stage design radically changed. What had started as speed and the freedom to tackle a stage how I wanted, turned into having to wait for blocks to cross lava, or some other platform to jump onto. I could handle it though. I mean, the graphics were still beautiful, the music was still catchy, and Sonic was still responsive. I mean, these were the fire stages, so it was to be expected. Surely the speed would be back in the next level, and that sense of freedom would return. Things livened up a bit in the next area thanks to being bounced all over the place. There was a definite level of appeal with being launched all over the stage, but even this began to get bogged down with having to wait for slow-moving blocks to open up your way. The stage design was much less free here as well, as each section was a dead end that needed to be climbed out of regularly, stopping any real momentum and speed. You would also get into situations where the spring pads would be purposely located in areas that would require you to get perfect bounces to move on. This grew tiresome as hell, and again the promise of speed from the first area was nowhere to be found. I got tired of bouncing around randomly, got more tired of waiting for slow-moving blocks to move forward, and the overall pace was just not fun. It honestly felt like the game was being slowed down on purpose so the developers could make the game longer. I persisted, however, in the hopes of more of the fun from the first few stages. Yet things would hit rock bottom when I landed in the Labyrinth Zone. Here all pretense of speed and freedom is utterly lost. The area is covered in water, creating two additional problems for the little blue blur. First, you are much slower in the water, and second, you can't hold your breath but for so long. Combined with the claustrophobic level design, this series of stages became a nightmare in tedium. With your speed gone, you basically meander through looking for air and trying to avoid spikes and insta-deaths. None of these levels are fun, and stand in direct contrast to the beginning of the game. I wouldn't have minded little pockets of water to contend with for the sake of challenge, but being stuck in this deluge, waiting for air bubbles, slowly climbing my way out of poor level design, stressed my patience pretty hard. It wasn't that this was difficult either. The base Sonic experience actually isn't a very hard game. It was the lack of fun factor that made it tough. These levels took a game I was already starting to dislike and pushed me the rest of the way. Of course, back then I stayed the course to beat a game because it was often the only thing I had to play for a while, and for bragging rights with my friends. Thankfully, things improved considerably in the next stage. Some of that open freedom returned and there was moments of great speed. Sadly, the stage design was again less than stellar. While I enjoyed the return of some of that speed, I found myself not really engaged with the simple platforming, the lack of enemies, and the general feeling of emptiness within the stage. I mean, the opening level was loaded with a variety of enemies, but here there were next to none. The boss fight wasn't so bad though. The final area suffers much of the same. There are next to no enemies, with only the stage itself offering any real challenge. You pretty much have to avoid the blind death drops peppered throughout the level, with all other gameplay basically just waiting for platforms and blocks to align where you need them. This again gets old quickly and just offers no real fun factor. And then it gets worse by regurgitating some of the awful designs you had to slog through earlier. These palette swaps again test your patience, not because they are challenging, but because they simply aren't much fun. All of this leads up to the final fight with Dr. Robotnik himself, in what has to be the worst end battle ever. You are stuck in a tiny room, and the doc just keeps popping up to be hit. That's it. No worries from any enemies, no worries from additional strategies. Just two pistons popping out with plenty of space to run away. And then it's over. That's it. What had been touted as this speedy experience was actually a poorly paced and slow affair for well over half the game. The level design was just plain bad in a lot of places, and frankly, the underwater segments were some of the worst levels I had played in any Genesis game. None of those were fun in the slightest. It's actually a fairly easy game too. The only real time I had any trouble was trying to collect all the Chaos Emeralds. You have to get them in special stages that open up after collecting a certain number of rings. The first few are easy, but it gets tougher later on, and missing one often ruins the entire playthrough. But you want to know something really strange? I still love a lot of the elements of this game. The opening 3 areas are incredibly fun to play, and that iconic soundtrack brings a smile to my face every single time I hear it. There is a powerful nostalgia here that is associated with the time it was released, and there is no denying it's still attached to it all these years later. But I can't really say the game is nearly as good as so many made it out to be. I had owned my Sega Genesis for over a year and a half before Sonic was released, and there were numerous better designed games already on the platform. It really was distressing to see so many claim it the best made Genesis title ever when so many Genesis games before it were better to me. It was a fine lesson to my 16-year-old self about how hype and mob mentality affects the things we support and buy. There were numerous Genesis games that should have spurred the console on to better sales to compete with its rivals, but those had fallen to the wayside, forgotten by the masses that flocked to everything game magazines and commercials told them to buy. I don't dismiss those of you that truly love this first Sonic game. Heck, I can even understand it because I enjoyed enough of it to see how you could have enjoyed the entire thing. But for me, Sonic simply was not the game it was made out to be. Poor stage design, the lack of any real enemies in the late game, and areas that completely stripped away the speed and freedom you loved early on really hammered it overall. And no matter how colorful it was, or how good it sounded, would overcome that. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. If you were a fan of Segas in the 1990s, chances are you played Sonic the Hedgehog in some form. Whether it was on the Genesis, Master System, or Game Gear, he seemed to be everywhere and talked about by everyone. The original launched in the summer of 1991, slingshotting the property to instant stardom. It sold millions of units, increased the installed base of the Genesis incredibly, and helped Sega compete favorably with Nintendo for the very first time in North America. So popular was the IP, Sega spun it out into an animated TV show, comic books, toys, and a number of other areas to increase its exposure. With things going so well, it was only natural for a sequel to materialize soon after. Sonic Team would begin work on Sonic 2 almost immediately after the first game, and it was released worldwide in November of 1992. Just like the first, it was met with massive critical and commercial acclaim. It sold millions of units, became a pack-in title to boost hardware sales, and pretty much solidified Sega's presence in the 16-bit home market. But was Sonic 2 actually any good, or did it just play it safe and do more of the same? In this episode, we will be taking a look at Sonic 2, break down what it got right and wrong, and I'll give you my final opinion. Some of you didn't care very much for my review of the first game, so let's see if this one does any better. The story here piggybacks onto the first with the evil Dr. Robotnik returning to try and conquer the world yet again. This time he is building the dreaded Death Egg, and only Sonic can stop him with the Chaos Emeralds. Sonic has a new sidekick tagging along called Tails, and he has a new move called the Spin Dash to help him crush his enemies. Gameplay is pretty much identical to the first overall. It's still momentum based, you still jump on your enemies, and speed plays a big role in getting around the stages. Those stages are typically loaded with places to build up speed and keep it going, though you do face your fair share of obstacles along the way. You get a lot of variety in locations as well. Sonic gets to run through casinos, oil refineries, aquatic ruins, caves, and even massive air fortresses. The new Spin Dash is easy to implement and fun to use. All you need to do is press down in the attack button to build up speed and then let it go, shooting Sonic off into a blur that can take down enemies, get him up steep inclines, and damage bosses. Your sidekick Tails is with you on your journey and is ever present on the screen. If you have two controllers plugged in, a second player even has some measure of control over him, making this the first game in the series with a co-op gameplay option. You do of course have the choice of playing as Tails or Sonic alone if you choose. Special stages are back but have been heavily modified over the original. Instead of a Mode 7 style spinning labyrinth, you get a forward-scrolling pseudo 3D half-pipe where you collect a set amount of rings to keep the action going. Do well enough and you get a Chaos Emerald at the end, of which there are 7 in total now. These stages do get tough as you collect more emeralds. Unlike the original game, having all of the emeralds grants you the Golden Sonic power, an almost invincible version of the Blue Blur that is even faster. You also need all 7 emeralds to view the true ending of the game. I think many of you will agree when I say the first game was a real looker in 1991. Despite the tiny 4 megabit cartridge, it was colorful, had loads of parallax scrolling, and was fast and smooth the majority of the time. Sonic 2 improves just about everything, however. Now on an 8 megabit cartridge, there's more animation, the color seems to be in full tilt overload, and man do you have to get excited every time you see all those layers moving in the background. The shield transparency has also been improved quite a bit. The first area, Emerald Hill, is very reminiscent of Green Hill Zone, managing to capture the same feeling without directly copying it. It feels safe, almost like coming home, and is a great opening act to adjust to the gameplay. Chemical Plant is darker and more sinister, making you feel like Sonic is in an area that can kill him at any moment. Aquatic Ruin feels like Sonic is deep in his adventure and has run across an oasis of beauty within the storm. This serves as the water level similar to the ones in the first Sonic, but are much more open, allowing you to keep moving without stopping constantly. Casino Night brings Sonic into the more metropolitan setting and throws you straight into the chaos of being tossed around like a pinball. Hilltop brings us back to the feeling of the first area but with much more danger. This is a beautiful area with great backdrops that hide death around every corner. Mystic Cave toys with you, making you think the open paths are safe, yet spikes await you in the most dubious of places. Oil Ocean brings you a similar threat of the chemical plant, but adds a lot more verticality. Later levels add even more variety to the visuals and layouts, giving Sonic 2 a look and feel that is quite a step up from the first. I remember the holidays of 1992, my 17-year-old self playing this one just to soak up all those great sights and bask in the glory of its plethora of background layers. Sonic 2 was a beauty, there's no denying that. One of the things I loved about the first Sonic was its music. It's one of the things about the game that really made me keep coming back for more. Could the sequel here ever hope to meet that same level of quality? Well, yes it does. The stuff here is just as memorable, and I dare say better in many ways. FM synth could be so distinctive and enjoyable when done correctly, and for the most part every track here is worth a listen multiple times. Like the visuals, the variety in each piece really stands out and leaves you more than satisfied when it's all over with. I have some favorites, so let's have a listen. Not to mince words or come off as unclear in my opinion here, but Sonic 2 is radically superior to the first when it comes to stage and boss design. While the apple doesn't stray far from the tree, these levels tend to have little of the insufferable slowness of some of the first game's areas. Even when it does slow down, it keeps the energy up by always keeping you moving. It's not perfect by any means, however. There are some spots where I was screaming at the television because I was stuck in some bouncing nightmare I couldn't seem to get out of. Some of the stage design was also confusing because it shoots you around so fast and everything looks so similar. The boss fights are also way too easy, something the game itself suffers quite a bit. You'll easily blast through 90% of Sonic 2 with zero issues. Like the first, getting all the Chaos Emeralds is the real challenge here and really adds quite a bit to the difficulty. Overall though, I feel Sonic 2 bests the first game quite strongly. I also feel this is a much better looking effort on the platform visually. No doubt the double meg size helped with the assets, and those backgrounds just look so much more alive and inviting. Hell, half the reason I play this to this very day is for its eye candy. Add in the incredible sound presentation and you have one hell of a game that did the hardware and company proud. The more I think about it, my outlook and acceptance of this title may also have something to do with my expectations. The first game came along and I wanted more of Green Hill Zone in the later stages. I wanted more speed, more enemies, more dangers that required quick decisions. As the first game slowed down, the less I enjoyed it. Going into the sequel here, I had a much more measured expectation, and it was well met with the improved stage layouts and variety. Sonic 2 was far from perfect, but it improved enough to really hit it out the park for me. Pound for pound, it's one of the best in the series I feel, and some of Sonic Team's best work. One of the interesting areas of Sonic 2's design was the addition of competitive multiplayer. Utilizing the platform's interlaced 320x448 mode, it used a split-screen approach to give each player their own view. The goal was essentially to compete in each race that graded you on your time, rings, and item boxes. I always found the squashed look of the visuals here off-putting, but I had friends that loved the hell out of it and always wanted to play it. You'll also be interested to know that Sonic and Knuckles lock-on technology used Sonic 2. Connect the two cartridges and you get to play as Knuckles for the entire game. I really enjoyed this feature because it added replay value to an older game at the time. Sega could have really pushed the Genesis a few more years with add-on cartridge technology. I wish they had done more with it. Sonic 2 also made its way to the arcade for Sega's Mega Play platform in the UK and Japan. It's the same game as before, it's just missing the two-player mode and the option screen. For you Sonic lovers that just can't get enough, a Sonic 2 was created for both the Master System and Game Gear around the same time. Like the first 8-bit release, it has a number of different design elements and has Sonic trying to rescue a kidnapped Tails. It's considered by many to be quite excellent, though I highly recommend you play it on the Master System due to the higher resolution. Unfortunately, this version was never released in the United States. Most of the media at the time loved Sonic 2 and its popularity endures to this very day. You have countless ways to play it now, from compilations to enhanced ports. I'm not kidding, Sonic 2 is pretty much on everything under the sun in one form or another. Sonic 2 was also one of the very first times I had read about Sega of America and Sega of Japan having trouble working together. It was developed at Sega Technical Institute in California. The Japanese Sonic team was mixed with some of Sega's American staff and things did not go well. The differing styles, the language barrier, and the vastly different corporate cultures became a defining moment for just how dysfunctional the company was. This went far beyond a simple rivalry between internal teams. It bordered on hatred and disrespect. So intense was this conflict, it spilled over into future development, affecting titles years after the fact. Stories do vary on who the assholes were, but needless to say, I advise you to read up on it if you ever want to see the inner workings of Sega's problems during their rise and fall. Fortunately, Sonic 2 still made its way out in stellar fashion. Sega had a major success with its pre-order campaign, launch, and financial success, something that gets lost in all the negative stories about their history. In fact, for all the stories you hear about Sonic's lack of success in Japan, it still managed to sell roughly 500,000 units there, which was no small thing on a platform with such a tiny installed base as the Japanese Mega Drive. Of course, Sonic Team would go on to produce a few more 16-bit Sonic titles that were pretty damn good as well, and I plan to take a look at those at some point in the future. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. There is no question that the appearance of Sega's Little Blue Blur helped reshape the Genesis platform into a bona fide contender for Nintendo, at least in the US and Europe. Sonic 1 and 2 had been massive sales success stories there, bringing in millions of dollars in profits and making sure the Genesis and Mega Drive markets were here to stay. So when it became clear that Sega intended to make a part 3, it was a surprise to no one. But like the company itself, the behind-the-scenes story is just as interesting as the quality of the final product. In this episode, we are going to touch on some of those legends and take a look at some of my opinions on the game itself. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Sonic 3. If you recall, Sonic 2 ends with the Death Egg crashing into the atmosphere in spectacular fashion. Sonic and Tails had won, and the evil Dr. Robotnik had been foiled again. But as the Death Egg descended into the oceans below, it actually crashed into Angel Island, a floating landmass that was home to Knuckles, its lone guardian. Dr. Robotnik quickly moves to scheme and confuse the newcomer, making him think that Sonic and Tails are the ones responsible for the island's new troubles. Knuckles sets to action, attacking the heroic duo as they make landfall, and so our adventure begins. The earliest days of Sonic 3's development actually intended for it to be a 3D isometric game that used Sega's Virtua Processor, the add-on chip that eventually got used in the Genesis version of Virtua Racing. It was to be called Sonic 3D, but with the development of the SVP running behind, Sonic Team needed to completely rethink the project, returning it to a standard side-scrolling action title. Those initial ideas are what would go on to eventually become Sonic 3D Blast. With Sonic Team wanting to still make the third game something different and special, they decided it would be a much larger adventure than the previous two entries, with a deeper story, more robust gameplay mechanics, and vastly superior visuals. Upon initial inspection, Sonic 3 is definitely a much larger feeling game. Stages are huge with tons of nooks and crannies to explore. And it's not just filled with the vanilla loops that dominated the previous games. Here, Sonic has zip lines to ride, ropes to swing on, and tons of different platforms to help him get around a level. The 10-minute time limit is in effect, and I've run it out completely on more than one occasion while still looking around. Sonic Team also wanted to deepen the gameplay a bit, which resulted in the shield from the previous games being expanded and upgraded. You get your standard spin dash, of course, but now you get 3 distinctive shields that not only protect you, but also add abilities to help you out even more. The flame shield keeps fire attacks from damaging you and adds the awesome fireball spin dash. This allows you to jump and perform an air attack by pressing the jump button again. The water shield allows you to breathe underwater and bounce for additional height. This bounce can also be used as an attack. The lightning shield protects you from electric-based attacks and gives you the ability to double jump by pressing jump again in the air. As a bonus, this shield also has a magnetic property that picks up nearby rings. Also new to Sonic 3 is the Insta-Shield, which allows you a brief boost to attack radius in the air and gives you a second of invincibility. It's essentially your special move when you don't have any of the shield powers. Of course, Sonic also has access to his usual assortment of items within each level. There are 1-ups to be found, invincibilities, and monitors to give you 10 rings at once. There's also the heinous Robotnik monitor that powers you down as if taking damage from an enemy. There's also two types of secondary stages that you can play in Sonic 3. The first is a special stage where you collect Chaos Emeralds. This is a pseudo 3D sphere-like area where you must collect the blue orbs. Collect them all and get a Chaos Emerald. Some of these are really challenging until you learn the layout. There's also a bonus stage where you collect gumballs to score additional lives, rings, and power-ups. Sonic 3 also has numerous options you can choose for this new adventure. You can opt to play as Sonic alone, Sonic and Tails together, or just plain old Tails by his lonesome. Unlike Sonic 2, however, Tails can actually fly in this one by tapping the jump button repeatedly. Also new is a save system that allows you to pick up your game on the last zone you were playing. Interestingly, a look at the PCB reveals no battery like many of the other cartridges that could save back then, and is one of the first games I had ever seen to use an FRAM solution. Where Sonic 2 had aimed to perfect the formula from the first, Sonic 3 was trying for something much deeper, larger, and more impressive. Sonic 3 also has a few competitive multiplayer options should you be interested. You can race against a friend in 5 completely new zones, or practice them in a time attack option. Along with the new zones comes new music, animations, and dangers. You can choose to race with or without monitors. It doesn't have the squashed look of the last game, so the visuals come off better too. You can choose Sonic, Tails, or Knuckles for these races as well. Not the deepest multiplayer out there, but a great distraction from the single-player story. The Sonic titles have always enjoyed a great look and feel to its visuals. They've been colorful, the backgrounds are always loaded with parallax scrolling, and it's among the faster platformers you could play back then. Sonic 3 continues that while adding some great detail that really gives it a distinctive feel. There's animation here that goes well beyond the first 2 entries, and the colors enjoy more shading and variation per stage. I mean it. Just compare Sonic 1 with Sonic 3 here on the first stage. Look at how much simpler the art is in the original game. There's just so much more going on in Sonic 3. This goes for your power-ups as well. Your shields have great animation, as do their secondary powers. There's just an overall feeling that so much more is happening in the presentation. Stage by stage, things get better and better. We go from beautiful green slopes to an Arctic wasteland in Sonic's finest looking adventure at that point. These improvements are punctuated by an incredible snowboarding segment where Sonic pulls a strider, and some pretty incredible line scrolling effects in the second half of the game. Sega had doubled Sonic 2's 8 megabits for Sonic 3, making sure that some of the space was used for better graphics. It was, and Sonic 3 is easily one of the platform's better looking games. The history of Sonic 3's sound and music is truly fascinating. Having worked with Michael Jackson before, numerous sources have confirmed that he helped Sega make the music in this game. The story gets pretty muddy as to the exact details because the work went uncredited due to Jackson's molestation charges that popped up around the same time. Whether he contributed a little, a lot, or none at all, Sonic 3's soundtrack is pretty damn good. Each theme for the zones is radically different from one another, and there are multiple versions of that tune for each act. But as much as I enjoy it, I consider Sonic 2's soundtrack superior. While you will enjoy what's here just fine, there isn't anything nearly as memorable as the best of parts 1 and 2. Here's a bit from each zone so you can make the call for yourselves. I want to be upfront here and say there is not a lot to dislike about Sonic 3. If you have enjoyed these games before, the third adventure is solid and well worth taking. The only real blemish is that it feels unfinished, and that's because it was. As Sonic Team's time began to wind down, they knew in order to make the February 1994 launch, they'd need to cut the game in half and release Sonic 3 as basically a part 1 of 2. Upon beating Sonic 3, you are met to what amounts to a cliffhanger and are left with no real resolution. This is where Sonic and Knuckles comes in. Released only 8 months after Sonic 3, it's the second half of the game and the real ending. So in order to get the full Sonic 3 experience, you need to use the lock-on technology and put the two together for a full-fledged adventure. It's not a problem now that we have images and hacks that bring the two together from the get-go, but back then, you were paying $100 to see everything Sonic 3 had to offer. I also began to get a little bit tired of the lack of enemies in the late game. Your challenge here revolves around the navigation of the stages themselves, and enemies take a backseat as any real threat to you. The bosses are kinda weak too. I was really hoping that by the time the third Sonic showed up, we'd have both stages and enemies that were worthy of my time. Of course, the good still outweighs the bad quite a bit here. This is a great looking and sounding game with huge levels, and by the time you add Sonic and Knuckles, the experience is almost too big for one game. The save game really helps in this regard, and you can put in some serious time to see everything it has to offer. The multiplayer, of course, adds even more to that content, and you can always play the story mode together with a friend as well. Bottom line, if you enjoy the Sonic games, this is about as robust and refined an experience as you'll find with Sega's mascot. Some of you may be wondering why I chose to review Sonic 3 alone. Well, it's because it was released before Sonic and Knuckles, so I played it all by itself all those years ago. I wanted you to judge Sonic 3 as I originally judged Sonic 3. Did it do enough on its own to be called a classic? I think it does, and fans of the franchise should definitely give it a try. It looks better than the previous two games, has more to do, and once you know the layouts of the levels, you can really keep the speed up. Sonic had been a pretty important part of the Genesis success story in much of the world, and the quality seemed to stay high with each and every release. And that's saying something, because I consider Sonic 2 to be one hell of a good game. The only area I wanted to see changed was the importance of the enemies being a bigger deal in the stage design. So much of this feels empty of any real challenge outside of surviving the environment obstacles, and it had been that way for quite some time. Still, with gameplay that was fast and responsive, Sonic 3 is definitely one of the best platformers on the Genesis, and well worth the praise it received both then and now. Its reissues have slowed down in recent years, presumably because of the Michael Jackson music thing, but you can still get it on Steam for a $5, and it includes all the extra content of Sonic and Knuckles. I have always considered Sonic 2 and 3 the high points of this series, and I still feel that way today. They are both easy recommendations to anyone interested in the Genesis library. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. 1994 was a really important year in the life of the Sega Genesis. The 32-bit era had begun the year before with the 3DO and Jaguar, with Sega's own entry that generation right around the corner. There were millions of Genesis consoles sold worldwide, and it was important Sega took advantage of that fact with well-received software. In February that year, they had already released Sonic 3. As most of you probably know, it was a development that started with Sonic Team using the SVP chip and intending much of the presentation to be using polygons and in an isometric viewpoint. The initial name of that project was even Sonic 3D. Work on that version of the game reached the prototype stage before the idea was scrapped and restarted. As Sonic 3 progressed, the levels grew larger, and Sonic Team was looking at a massive 34 megabit cartridge with a save battery. There was just no way Sonic Team would meet the original launch date, especially since Sega had prior commitments with its sponsors. Sonic 3 had to make its early 1994 release schedule, and this meant that it had to be split in half and released in two separate titles. That second part of these releases would become known as Sonic & Knuckles, and it landed just 8 months later in October of 1994. It was met with a monster advertising campaign that focused on the ability to lock on to previous Sonic releases. In Sonic 2, it allowed you to play as Knuckles throughout the entire game. In Sonic 3, it furthered that game's story and wrapped up the Death Egg Saga narrative for a complete experience. In this episode, we are going to take a look at it and see where it lands in the overall 16-bit Sonic universe. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Sonic & Knuckles for the Sega Genesis. The story picks up right where Sonic 3 leaves off. The Death Egg has crashed down to Angel Island, and your adventure to find the Master Emerald and stop Dr. Robotnik begins. While there is an entire narrative behind the scenes here, Sonic has never had any real cinematics sharing its deeper story, and you're pretty much left to connect the dots on your own. You get a choice of Sonic or Knuckles to play as by default, and both begin in the Mushroom Hill Zone, though their routes do change a bit as the game opens up. As you'd expect, our two heroes play very similar to one another. Core mechanics of jumping, the spin dash, using rings for life, and running feel very similar. You also get the power-ups that were available in Sonic 3, such as the various shields, water, lightning, and flame. You also get the familiar containers that have extra rings, lives, and invincibility. There are some important differences between Sonic and Knuckles' gameplay, however. While Sonic has a higher jump and is faster, Knuckles has the ability to glide out of a jump. This can be used to bypass large chunks of an area if timed properly, and it can be used as a direct attack against an enemy. Knuckles can also latch onto and climb up walls. You may be wondering how these moves affect him as a choice, and that comes down to being able to access a few areas Sonic cannot. And speaking of areas, just like Sonic 3, each zone is absolutely massive in size. There is a heavy focus on verticality and exploration, mainly because your bonus and special stages require it. If you make it to a checkpoint with 20 rings, you can jump into the Circle of Stars and take part in one of 2 bonus stages available. These are essentially mini-games where you can score extra items and even extra continues. Special stages are hidden within the levels as giant rings to discover. It's here you'll play Blue Sphere from Sonic 3 in an effort to win a Chaos Emerald. Collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds to earn Super Sonic or Super Knuckles. Finally, Sonic & Knuckles is a single-player only release. Like Sonic 3, Sonic & Knuckles is a very nice looking game. It has that trademark parallax you've come to expect from the series, and the colorful, organic art style. Outside of some changes to the stage themes, the overall quality and animation doesn't stray far from Sonic at all. Sprites look great and you still get that nice hurry up attitude if you leave the on-screen character idle for too long. I suppose all of that can be viewed as either a good thing or a bad thing depending on your preference. Sonic & Knuckles is the 4th mainline Sonic release on the Genesis in a span of just 3 years, and while there have been changes in the overall look of Sonic, I wouldn't call any of them major. On the surface, this makes sense because the 2 games are essentially 2 halves of one story, but the larger view is that this Sonic looks an awful lot like the last one. That really does put me of the opinion that Sonic Team could have done a little more to make this entry stick out more visually. There are a few nice special effects that I was impressed with, but this was another $50 Sega was asking for, and I admit being reluctant to invest that much, viewing it as a continuation of the presentation already present in Sonic 3. All of that aside, you still have to give Yuji Naka and his team all sorts of credit for the art and design here. Mushroom Hill was a great opening area to whet your appetite, and then Eat Zone's personality really stood out in how it was colored and how the backdrops were layered. Fans of Sonic 3 will get more of what they loved, and even if you want it to be wowed by new standout special effects, you still have to appreciate what's on display. Sonic was a great sounding series right from the get-go. I honestly don't think there's a bad track in the entire original 16-bit series, and Sonic & Knuckles continues that trend with another impressive soundtrack. Not everyone is worth bragging about, but you have to love how the FM synth is harnessed here, and given Sega's original touch. I have a few random selections for you, so you can see how you feel about it. For the overall critique of Sonic & Knuckles, I first must tell you a quick story. back at this game's original release in late 1994, I was sick of Sonic games. I thought the first one was okay, the second one was pretty awesome, and the third was a solid finish to the trilogy. Except it wasn't the finish. Sega had Sonic & Knuckles drop on us that same year, and I was just not feeling it. Added to that was the fact that the 3DO was having a great run on releases, and the Saturn was only a month away. I think a lot of other people felt that same way as well, because both Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles sold retail numbers well below Sonic 2. It took me a while to actually appreciate this for what it is, a well-made platformer with some of the better level design in the series. I'm not blowing smoke up your kilt with that statement either. Sonic & Knuckles has a great feeling to its speed and flow. I found these stages to be enjoyable while running through as fast as I could and exploring them at my own pace. By the time I got to Sky Sanctuary, I was hooked on this as one of my favorite Sonic titles so far. I'd give Sonic 3 the edge overall, but Sonic & Knuckles definitely holds its own. But Sonic Team had meant you to play both these games together. Taking Sonic 3 and locking it on to Sonic & Knuckles gives you a massive game with over a dozen zones and 3 playable characters with different abilities. Yep, you heard that correctly. When together, Sonic 3 and Knuckles allows you to play the entire epic adventure with either Sonic, Tails, or Knuckles. You had multiple endings depending on how you performed with the Chaos Emeralds as well. The truth is, no matter how sick of Sonic I may have been, the product was still top-notch. Looking back at it today, I've actually come to really appreciate the growth the series saw over the years while it was being made for the Sega Genesis. And Sonic & Knuckles was a great ending to it all. To add to the value, Sonic & Knuckles also allowed you to lock on to Sonic 2, giving you that game with a playable Knuckles. That lock-on technology was a stroke of genius, and it's a shame Sega didn't find a use for it earlier in the life of the platform. It could have given us extra episodes to some of our favorite games. Sonic & Knuckles brought an end to the Death Egg saga that was started in Sonic 2, and the gaming media of the day absolutely adored it. No matter what publication you read, no matter what region you lived in, Sonic & Knuckles was met with rave reviews. Sega had released 2 very similar Sonic games in the same year, and it still commanded the respect only the best software received. It sold over 1 million copies, and it's still well regarded by the Sega community today. It was also the last mainline Sonic to appear for the Sega Genesis, and I don't mind telling you, it was a dark time afterwards. The Sonic years during the 32-bit generation was a shell of the greatness we had previously, and it gave way to many 3D entries in the years after. These titles ranged in quality so much, you never knew which Sonic was going to show up. I think one of the biggest problems is, 2-dimensional speed doesn't necessarily translate to 3-dimensional speed. Sega is often hyper-focused on keeping Sonic really fast, and it usually means it's loaded with gameplay that sorta ends up playing itself, with you just tapping a direction or button as it plays out. I think for Sonic to be the best it can be, the series needs to graduate to a style where speed isn't necessarily the defining trait of the gameplay. I'm not saying lose the speed entirely, I'm saying maybe add enough around it where you actually have more to do than simply jetting through stages as fast as you can. We've seen bits and pieces of greatness in some of these 3D Sonic titles. Maybe one day Sega will put it all together and properly recapture the magic that made games like Sonic & Knuckles unforgettable classics. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.